The first time I drove through the gates of Pinewood Estates, I knew this would be my home. Mature oak trees lined the immaculate streets, their branches creating natural archways that dappled the sunlight on freshly paved roads. Children rode bicycles along spacious sidewalks, while neighbors chatted across meticulously maintained lawns. It was exactly what I had been searching for after years of apartment living a real community. The real estate agent pointed out the clubhouse, the community pool, and the walking trails that wound through preserved woodland at the development's edge. She mentioned the homeowners association almost as an afterthought. "They keep everything looking beautiful," she explained, as we pulled into the driveway of what would become my home. "Monthly fees are reasonable, and they handle all the common areas plus snow removal in winter." I had heard horror stories about HOAs, of course. Everyone has. But looking at the pristine neighborhood around me, I was willing to accept some rules in exchange for this level of community care. The house itself was perfect, a modest three-bedroom colonial with a charming front porch and a surprisingly spacious backyard that backed up to a small wooded area. Moving day arrived on a brilliant Saturday in early April. The movers had just finished unloading the last of my furniture when the first of my new neighbors appeared on my doorstep. Sarah from across the street brought homemade cookies and a welcome card. She pointed out her house with its bright blue door and invited me to a barbecue the following weekend. "You will love it here," she said with genuine warmth. "Most everyone is friendly, though watch out for the board meetings. They can get a bit intense." More neighbors stopped by throughout the afternoon. The Millers from 2 doors down brought a potted plant and recommended their landscaper. An older gentleman named Frank welcomed me to the neighborhood and offered to help with any household repairs I might need. And then came the visit I would later recognize as the first warning sign. 3 women arrived together, all immaculately dressed despite the warm afternoon. The leader introduced herself as Diane Winters, president of the Pinewood Estates HOA. Her smile never quite reached her eyes as she handed me a thick binder of community guidelines. "We are so pleased to welcome new homeowners who understand the importance of maintaining our standards," Diane said, her gaze drifting past me to assess the moving boxes stacked in my foyer. "The monthly meeting is this Thursday. We strongly encourage all residents to attend." The other women nodded in perfect synchronization. One of them, who introduced herself as Patricia, made a point of mentioning how the previous owners of my home had struggled to adapt to community expectations. The third woman said nothing, merely studied my front yard with pursed lips. That evening, I sat on my new porch watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in golden light. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby yard as fireflies began to appear along the tree line. For a moment, everything felt perfect. I had no way of knowing that this peaceful scene was merely the calm before a storm that would test not just my patience, but my very right to call this place home. The first violation notice arrived exactly 17 days after I moved in. The official letterhead of the Pinewood Estates HOA bore the signature of Diane Winters, citing me for improper placement of waste receptacles visible from street view. I had placed my trash cans at the curb at 6 p.m. the evening before collection, just as the neighborhood guide indicated. What the guide failed to mention was that receptacles could not be visible before 7 p.m., a detail buried on page 47 of the guidelines binder. I corrected the issue and made a note to review the entire binder more carefully. The second violation arrived 1 week later. Lawn vegetation exceeds maximum permissible height of 3.25 inches. I measured my grass. It was 3.5 inches in one corner of the yard. I hired a lawn service that day. The third notice cited unauthorized wind chimes creating noise pollution. The wind chimes had been a housewarming gift from Sarah across the street, who seemed genuinely confused when I mentioned the violation. "That is strange," she said, looking toward her own identical wind chimes. "I have had mine for 3 years with no issues." By the time the monthly meeting arrived, I had received 5 separate violation notices, each more trivial than the last. The community center was filled with rows of chairs facing a long table where Diane and 4 other board members sat with stern expressions. I took a seat near the back, nodding to the few neighbors I recognized. When the floor opened for community concerns, I raised my hand and stood when acknowledged. "I would like some clarification on the violation notices," I said, keeping my tone polite but firm. Some of the cited rules seemed to be selectively enforced. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Diane adjusted her perfectly styled blonde hair and fixed me with a practiced smile. "New residents often struggle with our standards," she said, her voice carrying the practiced patience one might use with a slow child. "Perhaps you should familiarize yourself with the guidelines before questioning enforcement procedures." Patricia, seated to Diane's right, leaned forward. "We take our community appearance very seriously. The previous owners of your property had similar difficulties adjusting." I noticed several other homeowners exchanging glances. One man rolled his eyes when the board members were not looking. Clearly, I was not the only one who found the enforcement excessive. After the meeting, a couple introduced themselves as Michael and James, who lived on the street behind mine. "Do not take it personally," Michael whispered. "The board seems to have it out for anyone new, especially on your street. Davis Court properties have been getting the worst of it lately." The following week, I returned home to discover my mailbox had been damaged and a small garden statue stolen from my front yard. The police officer who took the report seemed uninterested, suggesting it was likely just teenagers causing mischief. But when I mentioned the incident to Frank, my elderly neighbor, he frowned. "That is the 3rd incident on this street in 2 months," he said. "Jennifer 2 doors down had her custom address plaque taken, and the Gonzalez family had their solar lights removed. Only from houses on this street, though. Peculiar, is it not?" That evening, I researched security options for my property. My home had a side entrance that led to the backyard, which connected to a small wooded area. This seemed the most vulnerable point of entry. After careful consideration, I decided to install a security gate, nothing ostentatious, just a simple yet sturdy structure with an electronic lock system. Before proceeding, I reviewed the HOA guidelines thoroughly. Section 12.3 specifically addressed auxiliary structures and required submission of detailed plans, measurements, and materials for approval. I prepared my documentation meticulously, including photographs, precise measurements, and material samples. The guidelines specified that structures under 6 feet in height, made of approved materials, and set back at least 8 feet from property lines were permissible with proper documentation. The approval came 3 weeks later, with Diane's signature scrawled across the bottom of my application. I hired a reputable contractor who had worked in the neighborhood before and supervised the installation personally, measuring repeatedly to ensure compliance. The finished gate was elegant yet functional, matching my home's exterior perfectly. As I tested the electronic lock system that final evening, watching the gate secure smoothly with a satisfying click, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Little did I know that this very gate would soon become the centerpiece of a neighborhood battle I never anticipated. The certified letter arrived exactly 23 days after my gate installation was completed. I recognized the HOA letterhead immediately, but the bright red, urgent notice of violation stamp across the front made my stomach tighten. Inside, a formal demand ordered the immediate removal of unauthorized structure at 1453 Davis Court, my security gate. The letter claimed the structure violated 3 separate HOA guidelines and imposed a daily fine of $150 until removal was complete. I stared at the paper in disbelief. My hands began to tremble, not from fear but from a slow-building anger that made my vision blur around the edges. I had followed every regulation to the letter. I had received written approval. I had even kept copies of all documentation, which I immediately retrieved from my home office. The approval form was there, complete with Diane's signature. The submitted plans matched exactly what had been installed. There was no violation. I drafted a response letter attaching copies of all documentation and hand-delivered it to the HOA office the same day. The administrative assistant accepted the envelope without meeting my eyes. 3 days later, a notice appeared on community bulletin boards and in email inboxes announcing an emergency HOA meeting regarding unauthorized structures to be held the following evening. The timing, 4:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, ensured many working residents could not attend. I requested time off from work immediately. The meeting room was nearly full when I arrived, which surprised me given the inconvenient timing. I soon realized why. Diane had mobilized her supporters, who occupied the front rows with stern expressions. When I entered, conversations quieted momentarily as heads turned in my direction. Diane called the meeting to order. With 3 sharp taps of her gavel. "We are here today to address a serious violation of community standards," she announced, not even attempting to disguise her target. "Property values in Pinewood Estates depend on strict adherence to our aesthetic guidelines. When one homeowner decides they are above the rules, it threatens the investments of every resident." She then displayed a photograph of my gate on the projection screen, systematically detailing alleged violations including excessive height and unauthorized materials, neither of which was true. When she finished her presentation, she looked directly at me. "The homeowner has been notified and has chosen to ignore our requirements. Therefore, we must escalate enforcement measures." I raised my hand to speak, and Diane had no choice but to acknowledge me with dozens of witnesses present. I approached the microphone with my documentation folder clutched tightly. "I have here the approved application for this gate," I stated, my voice steadier than I expected. "Signed by President Winters herself. The structure meets every requirement specified in the guidelines." Before I could continue, Patricia interjected. "The approval was clearly issued in error. The board reserves the right to rescind approvals that contradict community standards." "That provision exists for applications that contain false information," I countered. "My application was completely accurate, as anyone can verify by simply measuring the structure." Murmurs spread through the audience. I noticed several homeowners exchanging surprised glances. Diane quickly regained control. "The matter has been decided. Daily fines will continue to accrue until the structure is removed. Next agenda item." The dismissal was so abrupt that I stood momentarily frozen before returning to my seat. As the meeting continued, I noticed a well-dressed man in the back row checking an expensive watch repeatedly. He caught Diane's eye several times, receiving slight nods in return. When the meeting concluded, they exited together, engaged in hushed conversation. That evening my doorbell rang. It was Sarah from across the street, looking uncomfortable. "I thought you should know," she said quietly. "That man at the meeting with Diane, That is her brother-in-law, Victor Landry. He owns Landry Development Group. Why would a developer be interested in an HOA meeting about my gate? I asked, though a cold feeling was already spreading through my chest. Sarah glanced around before answering. He has been trying to buy properties on Davis Court. Several neighbors have received offers significantly below market value. Those who refuse seem to start having HOA problems. Over the next few days, I did some research. Property records showed that Landry Development had already acquired 2 homes on my street. Both previous owners had sold after accumulating thousands in HOA fines for various violations. A pattern was emerging that made my blood run cold. Meanwhile, the daily fines continued accruing. A statement arrived showing I now owed over $2,000 in penalties. Attached was a notice that failure to pay within 30 days would result in a lien against my property. I consulted the guidelines again and discovered that appeals required a formal hearing, which could only be scheduled by the board president. My calls to request such a hearing went unanswered. Standing before my gate that evening, watching the sunset reflect off its perfectly regulation-compliant surface, something shifted inside me. This was no longer about a simple neighborhood dispute. This was a calculated effort to drive me out and acquire my property at a discount. The realization should have frightened me, but instead, I felt something unexpected taking root, a cold determination. I ran my hand along the gate's smooth surface, testing its sturdy lock. If Diane and her developer brother-in-law wanted a battle over this gate, they had severely underestimated their opponent. This structure, built precisely to code and approved through proper channels, would become the centerpiece of their downfall. They just did not know it yet. The rain started as a gentle mist when I left for work that Tuesday morning. By evening, it had transformed into a relentless downpour that reduced visibility to mere feet ahead of my car windshield. Traffic crawled along the highway, turning my usual 30-minute commute into nearly 2 hours of exhausting concentration. All I wanted was to get home, change into dry clothes, and collapse onto my sofa with the leftover pasta from the night before. I turned onto Davis Court, headlights cutting through sheets of rain, and pulled into my driveway with a sigh of relief. Gathering my laptop bag, umbrella, and the groceries I had picked up on the way home, I made my way around to the side gate. The security light flickered on automatically, illuminating my path through the deluge. That was when I saw it, an industrial-grade padlock, larger than my fist, secured my gate shut. A laminated notice had been attached with plastic ties. Unauthorized structure access restricted by order of Pinewood Estates HOA. The HOA logo was printed beneath in bold colors, as if to emphasize their authority. I stood motionless, rain soaking through my clothes despite the umbrella. This made no sense. Even by the most aggressive interpretation of HOA rules, they had no authority to physically restrict access to my property. This was not enforcement, this was trespassing. I tried the front door only to discover my key would not turn in the lock. They had changed my locks. They had locked me out of my own home. My groceries sat in puddles at my feet as I frantically dialed Diane's number. Voicemail. I tried Patricia next. Voicemail. I called every board member listed in the community directory. Not one answered. With nowhere else to go, I drove to Michael and James's house. They took one look at my drenched, shell-shocked state and ushered me inside. "They did what?" Michael exclaimed when I explained what had happened. James handed me a towel and dry clothes while I called the police. The officer who responded seemed uncertain about jurisdiction. "This is technically a civil matter between you and the HOA," he explained. though he agreed to accompany me back to the property to document the situation. In the beam of his flashlight, he photographed the padlock and the notice, then shook his head. "I cannot remove their lock without a court order," he said, "but I can confirm they have no legal right to change your house locks. That crosses a line into illegal lockout." A locksmith arrived an hour later, dripping wet but efficient as he replaced my front door lock. I could access my house again, but only through the front. My garage and backyard remained inaccessible behind the padlocked gate. That night, I slept on my sofa fully dressed, afraid to let my guard down in case the HOA attempted further violations. Morning brought no relief. Calls to the HOA office went unanswered. When I finally drove there in person, a handwritten, closed for administrative purposes sign hung on the door. I contacted 3 different attorneys that day, each one grimmer than the last about my prospects. "HOAs have tremendous power," explained the third lawyer, a tired-looking woman named Regina Moss. "The courts generally defer to their authority regarding aesthetic regulations. Your documentation of approval helps, but proving bad faith is difficult, and litigation is expensive, often prohibitively so." "What about the padlock?" I asked. "They have literally barred me from accessing parts of my own property." She frowned. "That is more problematic for them, potentially an illegal lockout. But fighting it means going against their considerable legal resources. Most homeowners simply cannot afford the battle, which is exactly what they count on." The estimated retainer she quoted made my stomach sink. It represented nearly 3 months of mortgage payments. Even if I won eventually, the financial strain would be devastating. That evening, drowning in despair, I received an unexpected text message from Sarah. "Coffee tomorrow at Beantree Cafe, 10 a.m. Important." The Beantree Cafe sat just outside the Pinewood Estates entrance, a neutral territory of sorts. When I arrived, I found not just Sarah waiting, but 4 other neighborhood residents I recognized vaguely from community meetings. They huddled around a corner table, speaking in hushed tones that ceased when I approached. "We heard what they did to your gate," said a woman who introduced herself as Rebecca. "They did something similar to us last year, cited our decorative fountain as a watershed violation, and imposed daily fines until we removed it." One by one, they shared their stories. James and Lisa had been fined for their garden beds being 2 inches too wide. Eduardo had received violations for his holiday decorations remaining up for 39 hours past the permitted removal deadline. Rebecca had fought a 6-month battle over the color of her mailbox, a color that had been approved initially. "It is not random," Eduardo said quietly. "They target specific streets where that developer wants to acquire property, create impossible living conditions until people sell for whatever they can get. Have you noticed that no one with violations ever gets on the board?" Lisa added. "The election process is structured to ensure only their pre-approved candidates win." That night I could not sleep. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and began researching HOA regulations, not just Pinewood's guidelines, but state laws governing homeowners associations. I discovered something shocking. Many of the board's actions violated state statutes designed to protect homeowners. The emergency meeting had been called without proper notice. The appeal process was being deliberately obstructed. The physical restriction of access to my property was explicitly forbidden under state law. As dawn broke, I sat surrounded by printouts of legal statutes, court precedents, and detailed notes. The first golden rays of sunlight fell across the papers scattered around me, illuminating something I had missed before, something that might change everything. The HOA thought they had locked me out of my property to break my spirit. Instead, they had given me the key to their destruction. This gate, this simple security structure that had become the focus of their harassment, had been installed with more than security in mind. And now, their own actions against it would become the evidence I needed. For the first time since seeing that padlock, I smiled. The realization came to me as I reviewed the security camera footage from the day of the lockout. I had installed these cameras as part of the gate security system, small, weatherproof, and strategically positioned to monitor all approaches. What they had captured was nothing short of damning. The footage showed Diane herself supervising as two men I did not recognize installed the industrial padlock on my gate. She pointed to various spots, clearly directing the operation with the confidence of someone who believed their actions were untouchable. Most importantly, the timestamp on the footage proved they had acted without providing the 24-hour notice required by both HOA regulations and state law. I watched the video 3 times, each viewing clarifying what needed to be done. This was not just about my gate anymore. This was about stopping a systematic abuse of power that had victimized multiple homeowners. What Diane and her board allies did not know, could not have known, was that I was not the easy target they assumed. Before moving to Pinewood Estates, I had spent 12 years as a property law specialist for a major real estate development firm. I had drafted HOA regulations, defended them in court, and knew precisely how they could be weaponized against homeowners. I had chosen to keep this background quiet when moving in, wanting a fresh start away from legal battles. That professional discretion was about to end. I contacted Sarah with a request to use her home for a meeting that evening. By 8 p.m., 7 homeowners sat in her living room with the blinds drawn, the same group from the cafe plus 2 others who had heard about our coalition. They listened intently as I explained what I had discovered. The HOA board has been operating illegally in at least 7 ways, I said, distributing copies of a document I had prepared. First, they have failed to follow their own procedures for notifying homeowners of violations. Second, they have obstructed the appeals process guaranteed in their own bylaws. Third, they have held emergency meetings without proper notification periods. I continued through the list, watching as expressions of confusion turned to understanding and then to determined anger. These were not just petty rule violations. They were systematic abuses designed to force people from their homes. But the most important issue, I concluded, is the illegal lockout action against my property. That crosses the line from civil regulatory enforcement into criminal trespassing and possibly conversion of property. What can we possibly do? Rebecca asked. They have all the power and resources. I smiled for the first time in days. That is what they want us to believe, but there is something they do not know about me, and something they do not know about my gate. I explained that the gate had been designed with a specific purpose beyond security. Every element had been carefully documented, photographed, and measured before, during, and after installation. High-resolution security cameras monitored it continuously, footage backed up to cloud storage. Most importantly, I had installed sensors that recorded every attempt to access or tamper with the structure. I built this gate as a legal trap, I admitted. In my previous career, I saw developers and HOA boards abusing their power repeatedly. When I moved here and noticed the pattern of harassment on certain streets, I suspected what might be happening. The gate was my insurance policy, built to be completely compliant but likely to trigger their overreach. Eduardo leaned forward. You planned this from the beginning. Not exactly, I clarified. I hoped it would never be necessary, but I made sure that if they did target me, I would have overwhelming evidence of their misconduct. The plan we formulated that night was methodical and comprehensive. Each homeowner had a role to play in building our case. Michael and James would gather historical records of selective enforcement. Rebecca and Lisa would document the board's financial records, which were legally required to be available to all homeowners. Eduardo would coordinate with other affected residents to collect their experiences. My role was the most confrontational, to continue documenting the board's escalating violations while preparing our legal strategy. Each day that my gate remained padlocked added to our evidence of illegal conduct. Each attempt to access my property through the locked gate was recorded and time-stamped. Over the next 2 weeks, our coalition grew to 15 households, all sharing similar stories of targeted enforcement and harassment. We met in rotating locations to avoid drawing attention, building our case piece by piece. What emerged was a clear pattern of abuse directed at properties of interest to Landry Development Group. The most shocking discovery came when Rebecca, who worked at the county records office, uncovered documents showing that both Diane and Patricia had received consulting fees from Landry Development. The conflict of interest was blatant and thoroughly documented in public records they likely never expected anyone to examine. Meanwhile, I continued my performance as the overwhelmed homeowner. I sent plaintive emails requesting removal of the padlock, which were either ignored or met with form responses reiterating the violation. Each communication was archived, each response, or lack thereof, adding to our documentation. 26 days after the lockout began, I installed the final pieces of our evidence collection system. Additional cameras concealed in birdhouses and landscape lighting provided complete coverage of my property. Motion sensors tracked every approach to the gate. I even placed a small weather-protected camera directly above the padlock itself, capturing clear images of anyone who touched it. "Are you sure this will work?" Sarah asked as we tested the equipment one evening. "They seem so untouchable." I gazed at my padlocked gate, now transformed from a symbol of oppression into the centerpiece of our counterattack. "They believe their position makes them invulnerable," I replied. "That is exactly why they will fall. They never considered that the gate they locked might be monitoring their every move. Every day they leave that padlock in place, they strengthen our case." That night, our coalition gathered one final time before implementation. 15 homeowners, once isolated and intimidated, now united with purpose. I distributed copies of our complete strategy document, including contingency plans and individual responsibilities. "Tomorrow," I told them, "we spring the trap." The State Housing Authority investigator arrived precisely at 9:00 a.m. on a bright Tuesday morning. Claire Matthews introduced herself with a brisk handshake and immediately began photographing the padlocked gate. Her government-issued SUV, with official seals clearly visible on the doors, had drawn considerable attention from neighbors peering through windows and slowing as they drove past. "This is quite the situation you have documented, Mr. Reynolds," she said, reviewing the binder of evidence I had submitted with my formal complaint. "Coordinated targeting of specific properties, illegal lockout procedures, board members with undisclosed financial relationships to developers interested in acquiring the same properties. If substantiated, these are serious violations of state housing regulations." 2 more official vehicles arrived 30 minutes later. Investigators moved methodically through the neighborhood, clipboards in hand, speaking with homeowners from our coalition who had agreed to provide statements. By noon, Word had spread throughout Pinewood Estates that government officials were conducting some kind of investigation. My phone rang at 12:37 p.m. Diane's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then played the message on speaker so Investigator Matthews could hear. "This is Diane Winters, HOA president." The voice sounded strained, lacking its usual imperious confidence. "It has come to my attention that there may have been some miscommunication regarding your property violations. Please call me immediately to discuss resolution options." "Interesting timing," Matthews observed dryly. "First contact in nearly a month, coincidentally on the same day state investigators arrive." By mid-afternoon, investigators had collected statements from 17 households, documented multiple properties with similar violation histories, and photographed extensive evidence of selective enforcement. Matthews informed me they would be subpoenaing board meeting minutes and financial records. That evening, flyers appeared in every mailbox announcing an emergency community meeting scheduled for 7:00 p.m. the following day. The tone was markedly different from previous communications. Concerns have been raised, and community dialogue is essential. Replace the usual imperious mandates. Word spread rapidly through our coalition's text group. Everyone understood this was the board's desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. We had anticipated this move and were prepared. The community center was packed well beyond capacity when I arrived the next evening. Every seat was filled, with residents standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The board members sat at their usual table, but their typical confidence had been replaced by tight smiles and nervous glances. Diane called the meeting to order with a single tap of her gavel. Gone was the authoritative triple bang of previous sessions. "We have called this meeting to address concerns that have been raised regarding certain enforcement actions," she began, her voice carefully modulated to project reasonableness. "The board is committed to transparency and fair application of our guidelines." Patricia quickly followed with a prepared statement about reviewing enforcement procedures and ensuring equitable application of community standards. The performance was clearly designed to create an impression of responsible leadership addressing minor concerns. When they opened the floor for comments, I was the first to stand. The room fell silent as I walked to the microphone, carrying a slim portfolio. The board members watched warily as I placed several documents on the podium. "My name is Thomas Reynolds," I began, my voice steady. "Until today, many of you knew me simply as the homeowner on Davis Court with the controversial gate. Today, I am speaking not just for myself, but for at least 17 other households who have been targeted by this board's selective and illegal enforcement actions." I outlined the evidence we had gathered. The pattern of violations concentrated on streets where land redevelopment had acquisition interests, the procedural violations, the documented conflicts of interest. With each point, I placed another document on the display table beside the podium. "Most seriously," I continued, 29 days ago, board members authorized and personally supervised the illegal padlocking of my property, restricting my access and creating an unsafe living situation. This action violated Section 553.103 of the State Housing Code and potentially constitutes criminal trespassing." The murmurs in the room grew louder. I saw several residents recording video on their phones. "What many of you do not know is my professional background." I paused, making eye contact with Diane for the first time. "Prior to moving here, I spent 12 years as senior legal counsel specializing in property law for Westridge Development Corporation. I have litigated HOA cases in 7 states and helped draft the very state regulations this board has systematically violated. The shock on Diane's face was visible even from 20 feet away. She began to speak, but I continued before she could interrupt. The security gate that became the focus of this board's harassment was designed and installed in complete compliance with all regulations, as documented by the board's own written approval, which was later rescinded without legal basis. What the board did not know was that this gate was equipped with comprehensive security systems that have documented every aspect of their illegal actions. I signaled to Eduardo, who activated the projection system. The screen displayed crystal-clear footage of Diane directing the padlocking operation. The timestamp was clearly visible in the corner. State housing authorities are currently reviewing all evidence, I concluded. I expect formal proceedings against both the HOA as an entity and individual board members to commence within days. The room erupted. Multiple residents stood, demanding answers. Patricia whispered urgently to Diane, whose complexion had gone ashen. I noticed Victor Landry, the developer brother-in-law, slipping out a side door as attention focused on the board. One by one, coalition members stood to share their experiences. Rebecca detailed the pattern of violations concentrated on streets where properties were being targeted for acquisition. Michael presented documentation of the board's procedural violations. Sarah revealed the financial connections between board members and Landry Development. A vote of no confidence was proposed from the floor. The motion passed overwhelmingly, with only a handful of the board's closest allies voting in opposition. By meeting's end, the community had established an interim committee to manage affairs until new elections could be held. As the crowd dispersed, I returned to my padlocked gate. It remained sealed, a final physical reminder of the board's overreach. But now, rather than a symbol of oppression, it stood as monument to justice in progress. The trap had been sprung, and those who had abused their power were finally facing consequences. The official ruling from the State Housing Authority arrived in a thick envelope marked with government seals. I opened it at my kitchen table, the morning sunlight streaming through windows that now represented true ownership agony. In the document was comprehensive, 26 pages of findings, violations, and mandated remedies. The Pinewood Estates HOA was found in violation of 14 separate state regulations governing homeowners associations. Individual board members were cited for conflicts of interest, procedural violations, and in Diane and Patricia's cases, willful and deliberate abuse of authority. The penalties were substantial. The HOA itself faced $175,000 in fines, while Diane and Patricia were personally fined $25,000 each. Most importantly, the ruling mandated immediate dissolution of the current board, required state oversight of new elections, and ordered comprehensive revisions to the HOA bylaws to prevent future abuses. All outstanding fines against targeted homeowners were invalidated, and restitution was ordered for those who had paid under duress. 3 days later, I heard vehicles outside my home. A work crew had arrived to remove the padlock from my gate. The crew supervisor presented me with a formal letter of apology from the Interim Community Committee, acknowledging the illegal nature of the lockout and expressing commitment to reformed governance. I watched as they cut away the industrial lock that had barred me from freely accessing my property for nearly 6 weeks. The heavy metal fell to the ground with a satisfying thud. The gate swung open smoothly, its electronic system still functioning perfectly despite the ordeal. The cameras that had documented every aspect of the board's misconduct continued their silent vigil, though their purpose now was simple security rather than legal protection. The community election was held under state supervision the following month. The meeting room could barely contain the unprecedented turnout. Nearly 90% of eligible households participated, compared to the typical 20% that had allowed the previous board to maintain power through apathy and proxy manipulation. I was surprised when several neighbors nominated me for board president. I declined respectfully, explaining that my experience made me more valuable in an advisory capacity to ensure proper governance procedures. Instead, a diverse group of 7 homeowners, including Michael, Rebecca, and Eduardo from our coalition, were elected to form a truly representative board.